Okay. Well, good evening and welcome to Lost and Demolished, Preservation Through 200 Years of Indiana History. My name is Callie McCune, and I'm the Public Programs Manager at the Indiana Historical Society. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. At the Indiana Historical Society, we are Indiana storyteller connecting people to the past. We do this by collecting millions upon millions of pieces of paper that tell Indiana's unique stories, and then finding intriguing and unexpected ways to share them, whether that is through publications, exhibitions, or events like this. It's through these pieces that we tell our diverse, unconventional, even saucy stories of Indiana, and to inspire a future grounded in our state's uniting values and principles. Within those millions of pieces of paper are photographs like this. There we go. Our photographs like this. They tell the story of Indianapolis. And these two buildings once stood on the same corner in the northwest side of the circle in the heart of the city in Indianapolis. It's a spot, when I first came to Indianapolis about 6 years ago, I wrangled a new historian friends into giving me a tour of the city. And on this spot, they told me that there was the greatest loss of Indianapolis architecture that had ever taken place. And I said, but which building? Was it the English Opera House, which is on the left, a grand Victorian building built, started being built in 1880s, and then it was added on to, building I wish I would have seen, somewhere that our city has always gathered in front of and had a balcony that presidents spoke from? Or was it the building on the right, which is the Jc Penney Building? It was built finished about 1951. It's a curving Indiana limestone, our state stone, and it's said to have moved the circle into modernity. On his visit in 1957, architect Frank Lloyd Wright, who I think we all know, he said this building was a little radical, but the only good one he saw in the entire city. My tour guide told me I get to be the judge. I hope you'll get to be the judge. Maybe drop that in the chat, which one you think is the greatest loss of Indianapolis architecture. But tonight we're gonna talk about how these buildings and lots of other buildings in our city speak to their moments of the past, how they tell the stories of our city, what we valued and how we changed. About 200 years ago, in 1821 today, Indiana's General Assembly first marked the new state capital of Indianapolis with a dot on a map. And on this Founders Day, we're excited to partner with Indiana Landmarks to bring you this conversation around the buildings that were built within that circle on the map, some of which have survived and some of which have been lost to time, and whose stories do they tell and what others we want to keep telling. So how is this going to work tonight? And can I hand you off to your moderator to get us started? So just a few pieces of logistics. I'll be handing this over to Justin in just a moment, who's our moderator for tonight. Our panel will introduce themselves, their work, and we'll have a bit of a conversation. As we get towards the end of the program, we'll have time for your questions. If you have one, please feel free to drop into the question and answer section of the webinar software. We will keep an eye on them and try to ask as many as we can as we go along. We know you're muted for tonight's program, but we do want to know what you think. Please utilize the chat box as we go along. You can you just make sure you're replying to both panelists and attendees so everyone can see and enjoy the conversation. And watch that box because I'll be dropping links as we go along tonight. Don't worry if you miss one, those will all be sent to you in a thank you email tomorrow morning. This program is being recorded and you can catch the replay of that video on our website in the upcoming weeks. So without further ado, I'm gonna toss this over to Justin to get us started. Hey, Justin.
Hey there, good evening. Thank you, Callie, and good evening to all of you that are joining us. Today is an interesting day, to say the least, but it's further proof that our places matter. And that it's important that we have these conversations about how we protect and keep our spaces and places. So as Callie mentioned, we'll get started actually with a round of introductions from each of our panelists, but I'll start. I'm Justin Garrett Moore. I am a program officer for the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, which is based in New York City, where I do work for the Humanities in Place program and their Monuments Project, which is looking at our commemorative landscapes across the US and beyond. My background, though, is that I am a Hoosier. I'm from Indianapolis originally, went to Shortridge and Arlington, School 60. But I've done work across my career thinking about places and through the lens of architecture, design, urbanism, and public spaces and places. So by way of introduction, we thought it would be great for each of us to talk about something that we think would be important to have saved in Indianapolis's history. And something that I thought was important to kind of remind or kind of recall is that we have signature buildings, important places, but it's also important to talk about our fabric, our communities, the sort of the everyday buildings that shape our lives and are important to each of us being connected to our communities. And so I thought it was important to not just mark an important kind of building, but to mark important places, right? The geographies, the neighborhoods. And I'm obviously African-American and very much connected to the sort of the Black neighborhoods in Indianapolis, and am still sort of devastated by the kind of the harm of demolition and urban renewal that has happened, in downtown Indianapolis, but really other communities that we continue to see today with demolition. With that, I want to hand it over to, let's go with Paula, and she can share a self-introduction and some of her images. And I believe we have a presentation that will share some images as we're talking through.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Paula Brooks, and I'm a third generation resident of Ransom Place neighborhood on the near west side. I also work for Hoosier Environmental Council, where I manage an environmental justice project. So I'm telling you my two greatest loves, history, preservation, and justice, fighting for justice. I grew up I have a memory of the area before the demolition. I grew up kind of watching just the neighborhood being disinvested and depopulated. And it makes me very sad when I look at MLK or West Street or Indiana Avenue, and to see what our public faces, what these streets look like now, and then to compare that to my childhood memory of a vibrant mixed use urban community, the kind of communities that urbanists are trying to recreate in Indianapolis. We had that, and it was destroyed for political reasons. So it just makes me very sad. I was asked to describe or talk about two of the buildings, or the building that I miss the most. And it's kind of a toss up, but the Fall Creek YMCA, I was part of the summer camp program every year over the Y. We learned how to swim. We did arts and crafts. We had field trips. We picnicked. It was just a wonderful experience. And even after I left home, I would come back home and I would always go to the Y to go swimming. So this Fall Creek YMCA had the best pool in the city. It was 12 feet, the water was warm. There wasn't a lot of children. It was just a great pool, and it's lost, it's gone. And what we have in its place is a generic building that could be located any place in the United States. You're also looking at another building that I have fond memories of, and this is the Phyllis Wheatley Y building. And there were, I don't know exactly how many, I can't remember, but all over the United States, there were these Phyllis Wheatley YWCAs located in Black communities and named after Phyllis Wheatley, who was a poet. I want to say that she had been enslaved, but don't quote me on that. But these Ys, they served as like centers for Black communities where there was job training programs. There were this particular Phyllis, this particular Y held a lot of community meetings. Also, most people, when you think about the area on the avenue, you automatically think jazz, but that is not the only music that was happening in this area. There was a lot of people who were classically trained musicians and singers who performed in this building. And the last thing that I can say about this building is that it had an indoor swimming pool. And that swimming pool was the only indoor swimming pool that Black people in Indianapolis was allowed to use until the 1960s.
Great, thank you, Paula. It's really important to kind of remember what we call our social infrastructure, and that the buildings matter, but equally important is the activities and kind of the community building that are held in these places. With that, maybe we'll hand it over to Paul.
Okay, thanks, Justin. My name is Paul Diebold. I work at the Indiana Division of Historic Preservation and Archaeology, which means our business cards are very long. That basically means that I'm one of two people for the state that look at all the National Register of Historic Places nominations that come in, and I've done that for, good heavens, 32 years now. And that's just among other responsibilities, but that's the primary one. I have made some new friends on the panel here, and a couple people on the panel I've known for a while. So that's good too, because preservation needs new people. That's for sure. So for my building, I was thinking about this, and initially I was going to choose a building that probably a number of people have forgotten about. It was the Caleb Blood Smith House. And that was a brick two-story house that was over on the IUPUI campus. And as you can guess, by virtue of me saying IUPUI campus, it's a parking lot now. He was an abolitionist, a very noted abolitionist. And that's just sort of emblematic of the expansion of that university, which came at the cost of some pretty important historic places. But instead, I actually chose a thing, and that would be the Citizen Street Railway system, our trolley system, and also our interurban system. And I believe we had an image. Here it comes. Yes. So this was the main terminal for the interurban system. And I think it was shared with the trolley system eventually. And of course, this building is a big loss. This was on Market Street, where the ISTA building is, the State Teachers Association building, which is right by the Capitol building. And this building was designed, I think, about 1910 by Daniel Burnham, a very famous architect from Chicago. So, you know, it was a real, we like to say world class in Indianapolis, and it was definitely a world class building. And the shed structure was where all the trains came in and turned around or were serviced and whatnot, where you could pick them up. I have a vague childhood memory of going there or walking by there with my mother, being held by the hand and seeing buses go in there. And I did realize that later did become the bus terminal before it was demolished for the ISTA building. But the bigger thing is the system that was everywhere in the city, and Indianapolis was at the cutting edge of transportation technology. Believe it or not, we were at the cutting edge, and for a variety of reasons, we threw that all away, and it's a very sad loss. Every now and again, when a street project is done, people are surprised to see, they'll scrape a street down, they'll be surprised to see the rails still in the street. So that's kind of the legacy of that. But have we not been more short-sighted or short-sighted? It would have been possible that we could have still had that system like some other cities still do. But to me, that's a real tragic loss of something that was really, really ahead of the curve. And the loss of this building is emblematic of that.
Wonderful, that's great. I love the link to transportation systems. And as we sort of situate this conversation with the bicentennial and thinking about the last 100 years of Indianapolis, we also wanted to be sort of forward thinking about what the city needs in the future. So it's always great to kind of learn from the past and maybe from past mistakes. And last but not least, we've got Mark.
You're muted, Mark.
And I thought I was going to be so clever there. My name is Mark DeLassy. I'm Vice President of Preservation Services at Indiana Landmarks, and we are the statewide historic preservation organization. We've been around in Indianapolis since 1960, and we are privately funded. We don't receive government money. That's always a question we get. And basically are supported through memberships that we have of people throughout the city and the state. So we certainly appreciate that support and the fundraising that we do throughout the course of the year, the people that support us that way. We really appreciate a collaboration like this one tonight with the Indiana Historical Society. This is a wonderful opportunity to talk about important landmarks and those places that I think are special to Hoosiers. So I know I was asked to talk a little bit about places that I miss, that I wish that we still had on our cultural landscape these days. And so Callie, if you can bring up a couple. My first is the Polk Dairy. And this was located just south of 16th Street on the east side of the Monon Trail, what was the Monon Railroad then. And I just love this building because it's quirky and fun. To incorporate the milk bottles into the front facade of an industrial complex, I think was sort of ingenious and probably a sign of the personality of Mr. Polk, who had this place built. He was actually out of Greenwood, is where their primary business was. They had for decades had a canning business in the Greenwood area tied to local agriculture. And there's even a wonderful building in Greenwood that is a gift that they gave to the community, which I think is just called the Community Building, but was built around 1920 as a memorial to the parents, the elder Polks that started the business. But they, around 1910, built this factory in Indianapolis, and it's interesting, all of this is gone, but on the northern end of this site is a building that the Indianapolis Public Schools held on to for years as a storage facility. And it was actually the stables for the Polk Dairy, where all the horses were taken care of that delivered the milk through carriages on a daily basis. So yeah, it'd be nice to still have this one. It's gone, but at least we have photos to remember it by. And then my second example real quickly is a property called the Essex House Hotel. And I like this one because Indianapolis had very few examples of outstanding modern buildings. And you know, unfortunately, I was reminded when Paula brought up the Fall Creek Y that was another interesting modern building that unfortunately isn't on the landscape anymore. But this building was on Pennsylvania Street at the corner of Pennsylvania and Vermont, directly across the street from the Indiana World War Memorial. And it was built in 1952 by the architects Russ and Harrison. And it was interesting, I'd actually crossed paths with that firm previously in a hotel they had designed and built much earlier in Terre, Haute, called the Terre Haute House, which has also been demolished, unfortunately. But this one is a later example of their work, 14 stories, so it had a significant presence. The building only survived 44 years before it was torn down in 1994. One of the kind of significant things I'd just like to note about its history is that this is one of the first gathering places for the LGBTQ community. They had the first Pride brunch at this location at the hotel. And you know, unfortunately, we've lost a lot of landmarks in Indianapolis that are associated with the LGBT community, and this is one of those. So
that's great. It's been so wonderful to hear the sort of the spectrum of kind of projects and places that each of you have shared. I do want to take the conversation now to more of a dialogue around how we think about preservation in Indianapolis, but also in the field generally, and as we look for, as I mentioned earlier, the kind of the future for how we want to do this work and how we want to affect our communities. So I have a few different questions that we'll walk through for the rest of our time here. And the first one is to look back at the last 200 years and actually Mark's kind of last comments about the idea of saving something like a modern building for something like an LGBTQ group raises an important question, which is, you know, how have we changed our orientation around preservation? You know, what are we preserving? Are we just preserving the buildings? Are we preserving the history, the culture? And how has that changed kind of over time? So curious to hear from each of you sort of how you see the preservation movement, preservation practice in Indianapolis as it's been changing and how it sort of began and how it got its start. Maybe you'll start with Paul on this one.
Well, I have a little running joke going with Suzanne. I like to say that the preservation movement started right here in Ransom Place in 1947 during the Indianapolis Redevelopment Commission. There was a group of people who fought to save their homes. The conversation was that we're doing some slum clearance. And of course, closer that you got to Fall Creek, the houses weren't as sturdy. but the houses are close to MLK, they were virtually mansions, and there's actually 3 remnants that are left now in the 1000 block of MLK that people just zoom by, and the block gets no love. But Henry Fleming and Carrie Jacobs, they saved that block. They fought back, they saved that block, and they also forced the commission to revise its plans. They had planned to demolish everything south of 10th Street, and that was changed to investing in the homes that now comprise Ransom Place. So if they hadn't have taken that stand, and they were able to do that based on their position in society, I don't think that going forward, the thought would have been to save, especially vernacular homes and homes that people who were important in the Black community, but maybe not so much in the wider general society as well known. But Suzanne humors me on this point, but I have not let this go. I really think that was the birth of the preservation movement, and not starting with the contemporary tale as it started in Lockerbie. And no disrespect to Lockerbie, but I really think that it started over here on the West Side.
Yeah, that's really great. I posted in the chat a link to a video that's at the IU archives that talks about some of that history, the sort of the parallel work with the urban renewal and slum clearance that was going on, but that simultaneously there were preservation efforts happening right there, as you mentioned, around Ransom Place and the near West Side. So it's a great video for folks that have time to check that out. How about Paul or Mark? What are your takes on kind of the Indianapolis story for how preservation is getting its start and transforming?
Do you want to go first, Mark?
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay. Well, that's interesting, Paula, that you had mentioned that things can be looked at as going back to the 40s. Because you can also look at the series, and Mark will know about these, and I think the folks at the Indiana Historical Society will know about these, because I think they have her papers. There was a journalist, Agnes Mccullough Hanna, and she was, I believe, descended from the Hanna family. There's still a Hanna mansion on the south side that's a beautiful 1850s brick structure. And she would every week or every so often write an article about the latest Indianapolis house that was going to be demolished. And gee, isn't it a shame? This house was very important. She would provide a little history and have a photographer take an image of the house. Sometimes it was just, here's an interesting house you might not have passed, you might not have realized this place is important. Evidently those had enough of a following that she did that for quite some time. And so I take that as an inkling. Maybe it was just sort of nostalgia, but I think there was more to it. And she was definitely pointing out that these things are being lost for what she termed to be, you know, oh, it's going to be some kind of office. It's going to be, you know, something else. It's going to be a parking structure or something, or a parking lot, I guess at that time. And so that's I think you can kind of you can kind of look at that and say, well, there was certainly a sentiment if there wasn't a methodology to look at preservation. And interesting, and I'm sure Mark will want to elaborate on Lockerbie Square, because Landmarks was so very involved in that and critical to that movement. But of course, at first in Lockerbie Square, the idea was, let's tear down everything, but the Riley house, which really wasn't his house. He was a boarder, but you know, that's the way we go with artists. Artists sometimes don't have a lot of money. And you know, that's another part of the story that wasn't really told. What was the nature of being a writer in the 19th century? They went to tear all that down and make what were they, Mark? 1/4 scale replicas out of solid limestone of famous Indiana buildings that the kiddies could crawl all over. It would have been a disaster. You know, it would have been horrible. And instead, the city and Indiana landmarks and the people who live there said, well, maybe we should actually use these houses or encourage people to keep using them. And so that's certainly the more modern place where all these ideas, saving the housing and ransom place, the nostalgia, and then it kind of coalesced, I think, in a certain way with some of those early neighborhoods. So another interesting thing, I saw very early on the two images of Monument Circle and the English Hotel and the Penney's building, and someone was not liking the Penney's building, and certainly that's, you know, it wasn't my favorite. There you go, thank you. It wasn't my favorite when I got interested in preservation. It was still there. I think I remembered it from a kid. I probably walked through the building when I was a kid, shopping for something or another that I didn't care about. But I'm reminded of there's a very famous cathedral in France. It's called Haute Cathedral. It's a Romanesque cathedral, and in the 1600s they were talking about putting a new front on it. And those of you who know architectural history would cringe because the sculptural work is famous. It's prized beyond belief today. And someone in charge of that project said, you know, someone might want these old stones. We don't know. They're 500 years old now. Maybe somebody will want them in the future. And heaven's sakes, are we glad that thought prevailed? So, you know, maybe someone would have, maybe we would have valued Jc Penney if it was still around. It's not the historic image of Monument Circle we think of. In a certain way, I think it's kind of a more interesting building than what ended up being there. But you know, by that time it was too late. There was no other option. The Penney's building, I think, was gone. So you know, you have to kind of look at these things. Sometimes we're not really sure what we want. We don't know what we want until we get to the future, and if we curtail that option, you know, then it's done.
Now, this image actually kind of prompts us into sort of the next thread of the conversation, which is to talk about, you know, how we're deciding what buildings are worth preservation, and sort of raise an important point about kind of the role of architecture, like what's valued, who is valued, is absolutely a part of our conversations. And in this work, it's interesting to start to navigate what role organizations are playing in preservation, and sort of in concert with that role, what role that neighborhoods or communities are playing, right? To sort of advocate for, you know, what buildings are valued, what places are valued, and what's preserved. So Mark, I think you're absolutely in a good position to speak to this. You know, and I think the example that you raised of the LGBTQ sort of site and example speaks to this. So how have we sort of, you know, thought about the role that organizations are playing in deciding what's worth preserving?
Yeah, well, obviously it's changed. I mean, in the beginning, I feel like the preservation movement here in Indianapolis was much more, and nationally probably, was much more focused on the idea of taking historic buildings and trying to make them, say, into a house museum, you know, and saw maybe education and tours and that kind of thing is a key part of the role of the organization. And that's how Indiana Landmarks started. You know, we bought the Morris Butler House, a significant piece of architecture. We were going to save it. We did tours. And, you know, in more recent years, those tours have dramatically declined. That's just not where people's interest is in the 21st century. And so we no longer operate the Morris Butler House as a house museum. So where that worked in 1965, it doesn't work in, you know, 2015. So we've had to shift, I think, in the world of preservation. I also just want to add, I think preservation has become much more of a profession. Certainly back when our organization started, it was, you know, as the saying goes, you know, blue-haired ladies in tennis shoes, kind of a more of a volunteer-driven kind of an effort. And as there began to be educational or academic programs in preservation, I know that when I first looked around for a grad program, there were like 6 programs in the United States that taught historic preservation at the master's level or above. And so things have obviously changed in that way, that you have many, many more people that have been trained in the field that are out there now able to talk about it and you know, as a profession. So to your question about determining, I guess, significance and what places should be saved or looked at, you know, Paul's agency within DNR and our group have for decades partnered on a survey process where we actually hire individuals to go out and do surveys on a county by county basis of the entire state of Indiana. And every state is mandated to do this through the National Historic Preservation Act. And in those county surveys, there's a 4-tier rating system for which properties are the most significant and which are not as significant. Now, I would say that even by the short amount of time since we've finished Indiana, I think we've started to look at preservation in a different way, that we've begun to embrace vernacular architecture. So maybe the buildings that were on the lower end of that rating system, we're starting to view that for different reasons, those properties are just as important as the ones that were designed by architects for wealthy white people that took up the first 40 or 50 years of the preservation movement. And so now we're looking at cultural landscapes, we're looking at LGBT, we're looking at African-American resources, those that were unique to Native Americans and the Hispanic community. So everybody is a part of the American story and that diverse story, and we need to be sure that those places are all documented, and if threatened, that there is an effort made for those to be preserved and continue to be part of our communities.
Yeah, it's so important to sort of acknowledge the point you're just making, right? The complete American story, the complete American history, and a lot of people and places have been sort of left out in that work. But I do want to pull in Paula to sort of speak a bit to this idea of what role the actual neighborhoods and communities are playing, and maybe to connect it with this thread that Mark was just raising, which is kind of, you know, whose stories are being preserved, whose work and legacies are we caring for, whether that's from, you know, the idea of the building or the artifact, but also kind of the process that we take in the work of preservation. So I know you've been doing tons of work over the years with this, so curious your take on that.
Well, both DNR and Landmarks, I think it's interesting, and Mark mentioned the change of mindset, but I think that mindset was always in those organizations. And I'm saying that because the second time that historic preservation saved the area was in the late 80s, early 90s. And there was this woman, Jean Spears. She actually was one of the founders of the Lockerbie People's Club. She was a preservationist. She had a beautiful home over there, but she had roots over here in this area. And we were losing homes. Anytime anybody died, the home was demolished. Landmarks came in and had done a inventory where now we had data to show that we had lost 2,500 homes. That data was there. Paul, if I'm not mistaken, he actually worked on documenting what was left. That's social justice work, in the fact that that work led to the creation of a historic district or preservation district here in Ransom Place, which stopped the demolitions, which stopped the displacement. It also shined a spotlight on the importance of Black history to Indianapolis. Now, the challenge is maintaining that. This city does not value Blackness. And so it's very difficult over the years to keep that forefront. So here in Ransom Place, for instance, our newest neighbors, they have no idea about the history of preservation in this neighborhood. They just know that if they want to do something to their home, they have to go through IHPC. Fayette Street is another example. And Jean Spears' daughter, Claudia, she was so pained when the canal was being redeveloped that she actually worked again with Landmarks and DNR, the city at that time. And she went all around the area and saved homes, moved them over to Fayette Street. The city stabilized them, and then they were auctioned off, and it was a success. But that work of preservation, again, is social justice work. And I think this year has really, we had the opportunity this year to really elevate that thesis.
Yeah, that's so important. It's actually a combination of social justice and environmental justice when you think about it, right?
Yes.
The idea of maintaining and preserving and caring for things is sometimes better long-term, not just for us socially and culturally, but also in terms of environment. You know, Paul bringing up the kind of the old transit system at one point, right? That there sometimes people get things right and then we forget in pursuit of something new. But Paula, your point is actually sort of raising I think an important point and question for a lot of people. There's always the tension that preservation is going to be complicated and cumbersome and put constraints on people, and not everyone sees themselves in the world of preservation. But the kind of the technical pieces. So what does it take to get a place nominated on the register? How do you sort of keep places maintained properly once they're in that system? Maybe Paul or maybe Mark can speak a little bit about that and the work that it takes to sort of navigate between the technical and, you know, maybe the more aspirational aspects of preservation as you see it in Indy.
You want to go ahead, Mark?
Well, I mean, we promote the National Register process, which is what Paul oversees, but we promote it all the time because we think it is a way to talk about those places that are unique and special in our communities. And so Indianapolis, I think, has, gosh, Paul would know the numbers, but I mean, it's probably 50 plus historic districts that are on the National Register of Historic Places. I may be off on that number and he can correct me, but
I think it's close. I think it's about that.
Somewhere in that vicinity. And, you know, many of them are, you know, certainly well-to-do, architecturally significant, high-end designed neighborhoods like, say, Meridian Street, that, you know, was locally protected by the state of Indiana as far back as 1974. So that's certainly an earlier example of preservation action in the city. But we've also worked, like within the past 1 to 2 years, the Riverside Historic District was listed in the National Register. We worked very closely with their neighborhood leaders at the Riverside Civic League. You know, that area is under people don't know it, I don't think, but it's under an extreme amount of development pressure right now, where people are buying up sort of affordable housing and demolishing it so they can put up new, larger structures or apartments. And so the threat is real. So unless we start looking at methods by which neighbors and neighborhoods can protect the integrity of their built environment, then we're going to see this stuff lost. And, you know, Paula mentioned IHPC earlier because Ransom Place, the neighborhood she lives in, is locally protected by the Indianapolis Historic Preservation Commission through the fact that as a conservation district, I think if you build there or demolish in that neighborhood, it has to be reviewed first by the city. You know, so if that might be a path forward that the folks in the Riverside neighborhood, for example, or others want to pursue to protect and manage the growth that occurs in their neighborhood in the future, that's certainly something that we can work with. But I also want to just add, you know, I think particularly in minority communities here in Indianapolis, I think there's an issue of trust. You know, when the city came in and for decades demolished and cleared and urban renewal and leveled their communities, you know, that's why we have IUPUI. That's why we have areas around hospitals and other, you know, institutions in the city, is that's where lower income and African Americans lived. And they were the victims, unfortunately, of that clearance. And so there's no trust there between the two entities. And so until that can be rebuilt in a way that benefits those neighborhoods, I think that's another issue that we need to tackle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, the relationship between preservation and development is another one of those things that has been evolving and changing, you know, adaptive reuse. And a lot of times people associate preservation with gentrification pressures, frankly, and other things. And so we do have to really be mindful of that in navigating it and doing the work I think, to expand kind of who has agency and some degree of power through preservation, as opposed to it's something that powerful people do to places instead of with places. We're going to transition to questions soon, but I did want to give everybody kind of a last round sort of question and point that I think will be important. One is to sort of ask what kind of, how do people get involved in preservation locally in Indianapolis, in all these different types of communities and efforts. And connected to that, I think is who gets to be a preservationist, right? Like, who is it? What is it? Beyond, as I think Mark raised earlier, you know, the person that has some kind of, you know, educational or other credential. Maybe Paula, since you're a de facto preservation leader.
Well, I actually think preservation, you have to love yourself and you have to love your heritage. And I say that because for instance, any little small village you go to in France, people love their buildings. They love their villages. They're very proud of homes that are maybe 300 years, stone floors, not necessarily fancy or luxurious. And so that idea that you talked about, preservation being the purview of the wealthy, I think that that's where that mindset has to change, that you have to value, sometimes the most valuable asset is the most simplest asset. It's something that brings you joy, and not necessarily that it's always so grand with marble and gold and all of this. And I don't know how to bring people to that. I struggle with that all the time, just in terms of gentrification. There's younger people tend to want a different type of housing. So trying to convince younger people, to move into Riverside that has beautiful early 20th century homes, but that are small. It's just a hard sell. And I don't really know what that answer is, Justin. I wish I did.
Yeah, I hear that. One of my favorite preservation projects is in North Carolina, where a group of artists joined together to save Nina Simone's childhood home, right? And I think there are kind of other sort of actors and people that, to your point, kind of starts with like loving your culture, loving yourself, loving your places. And so hopefully we see more people thinking and operating that way, especially now.
Justin,
Marker.
Well, I just want to quickly say, I think there's a really short answer to your question. And I think, who do we want to see be preservationists? Everyone. I mean, there's no reason for somebody not to want to save their neighborhood or their home or make the places around them more attractive and beautiful and love their neighbors. I mean, it's something that we want to attract as many people to. And I think everybody maybe is a latent preservationist, and maybe we just need to bring that out of them in some way, shape, or form. Maybe that's being a volunteer. Maybe that's attending a tour or participating in a workshop to learn how to better, restore your old windows in your house. Whatever that may be, there's lots of different ways for people to get involved. And we would certainly love to see more of that, I think, here in Indianapolis and Marion County.
Right. So the first step threshold to that is just go to your website, mailing list, that sort of a thing, right?
Sure. I mean, for us, yes, indianalandmarks.org if they want to visit there. And I'm sure Paula and Paul have places for folks to go to.
There's a myriad of local not-for-profits that would love to have people get involved, and kind of combining comments from Paula and Mark. So if you look at what happened in Ransom Place, yes, I reviewed the nomination, but that whole effort, and Mrs. Spears knew this. She understood Civics 101, right?
Oh, yes.
She knew there are things that Mark's organization can do as a not-for-profit that mine can't. And she knew that there are things that the city legally can do to protect Ransom Place that my office can't. And a discussion I hear a lot these days is how do we get the idea of giving some kind of basic grounding to everyone to understand how you access these agencies, because I'm very much, there's two of us to go around the state and for National Register, and if someone doesn't raise their hand and say, I need help, you know, we don't know you're there. So,
Right.
so knowing, you know, what these agencies can do as a state agency, Mark's agency as a not-for-profit, Paula's group as a local advocacy, local neighborhood group, and understanding how you put all those things together. And yes, it's complicated. Maybe it should be different, but that's kind of the way when it works, as it did at Ransom Place, and everything hits on all the cylinders. That's kind of the way America works. We have these different sectors, and
Right.
we used to tell people, explain this to people, and I don't know that we have so much anymore. And I think that's really important.
Great.
That's a great point.
So I'm going to transition us to our audience questions. So the first is, can any of you talk about how preservation has changed to save places by utilizing them for other purposes, such as the Bottle Works project that was mentioned over on Mona?
Well, I mean, go ahead, Paul.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, the Bottle Works project is great. And that's an example of that they've utilized, there's a federal tax credit that they leveraged to rehab all those buildings. So the developer knew how to take advantage of those things. Our office had a small role in changing the National Register nomination for that area to include some LGBTQ information that wasn't in the nomination originally, and also then make all of those buildings eligible for that credit. Another good example of that, though, it's maybe going a little bit unnoticed, is the old Ford motor car factory on East Washington Street. Mm-hmm. It's a fantastic rehab. And that's an example to me of a building. It's an industrial building. It was very plain. People worked there. And I like the fact that we're getting more buildings that were common workplaces for all kinds of people. And that's very exciting to me. Sorry, go ahead, Mark.
I was just going to add to that, you know, adaptive use is, you know, one of the key ways that buildings are saved, period, here or anywhere else. And when they cease their original use, we have to get creative and start looking for new uses. It's interesting, in addition to the Ford Motor Company plant, the review board that Paul works with is hearing a couple of other interesting adaptive use projects at your meeting this month, and to be listed in the National Register. And one of them is the PR Mallory plant, also on East Washington Street, a little further east of the Ford plant, that is just completed a $32 million rehabilitation. So I always emphasize the point, historic preservation isn't just done for, you know, the niceties of saving an old building. That's economic development. When you're putting $32 million into a historic underserved neighborhood, or the Bottle Works project, it's a $300 million project that puts major investment into the Mass Ave corridor at a time we really need it. And then the second example is the James Roberts School number 97 on East 10th Street, which was built to serve handicapped children that you know, had some pretty serious issues back in the 1930s. And this building was built with ramps on the inside for accommodating wheelchairs, et cetera. Well, that building was adaptively used as apartments. And that, I believe too, Paul, you can correct me, but I think was a historic tax credit project.
Yes.
They are therefore listing it in the register so they can secure those credits. So we have some great adaptive use projects in the community.
Great. Next sort of thread is, I think goes back to some of the images that we were sharing in the overall theme, which is around kind of what's lost and what's been demolished. So the question is, are there good examples of other endangered buildings in Indy that are being saved because something else was lost, right? So, here in New York, we have our Farley Post Office, Penn Station that just opened, right? So that was possible because we lost Penn Station. What's the Indianapolis version?
Huh.
Oh.
Got to think about that.
I tend to want to work to save the historic places, so I don't think as much about but I mean, certainly there's, generational change that occurs. I mean, our first or maybe second state capital was a, wonderful Greek revival building where a lot of important historic events occurred, and designed by a nationally significant architectural firm, but we lost that building, and now we have the state capitol that we have in its place. So, which is in and of itself, very impressive. I look at the whole World War Memorial Plaza, or the American Legion Mall, as people know it too, and that has that incredible World War Memorial on it, but that entire multi-block area used to be full of churches and commercial buildings and other uses that are now gone. But that mall there is a National Historic Landmark now for its importance in design and as a cultural landscape.
I do remember people saying that they felt that the loss of the county courthouse was a big motivator, and the loss of the English Hotel was also really drew a lot of ire from people. But I don't know if there's anything quite as iconic as Justin, as what you mentioned. I don't know that there's a single thing that I can really think of that was quite as quite as bad.
Kind of traumatic. Right.
Yeah.
Great. So another group of questions, I'll actually lump these two together. One is, how has preservation contributed to affordable housing in Indianapolis? And I think a related question is saying that if we are in the process of sort of revising kind of what counts or what gets identified as significant for preservation for neighborhoods, how does that connect to doing work like finding new alliances around issues like increasing homeownership or promoting economic development, small businesses, and community? So sort of the relationship between preservation and, let's just call it, community building, and what kind of work and new tools are people doing today?
Well, I can speak to that. I think the preservation leads itself to a different development model. Right now, the development model basically is a developer comes in with a little bit of money of his own or her own, and then they're leveraging that money and borrowing the bulk of it from a financial institution that dictates the scope and the scale of the building. I think with the tide turning towards more cooperative ownership models, so like community land trusts, neighborhood or community real estate investment trusts, or community investment trusts, where the idea is not to maximize your profit, but actually to provide housing over time. I think that that's how you can kind of marry preservation with providing affordable housing. I don't think that the current model that we have now serves us as well. And those historic tax credits are very important. The incentives that you can get from the federal government or even the state government that to preserve, I think that that's also important as well. And there was a big fight a couple of years ago to save the historic tax credits that Landmarks was intimately involved. I'm sure because they realized the importance of that.
Yeah, the Tax Act of 2017 almost eliminated the historic tax credit. So that was a fight to save it. So at least it's still there. It was changed a bit, but for the most part, it's still there as a tool for people to use. But and then there's also a state tax credit as well for private residential properties that people can pursue that covers 20% of the cost of a rehab. But to your point of affordable housing, much of the affordable housing work in Indianapolis is done by community development corporations. And those we're fortunate here in this community to have quite a few of them that are scattered throughout various parts of the city. And I believe that INHP, Indianapolis Neighborhood Housing Partnership, distributes funds that helps support those CDCs. And then the CDCs get community development block grant funds through the city for projects to rehabilitate existing housing for affordable housing or to assist homeowners that are in those properties already to continue to better maintain and be able to stay in those homes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great.
So
oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna throw in that I kind of see in different neighborhoods that a really important thing is having the pride in your neighborhood, and that's where I kind of see the designation being important. You know, we can't, unfortunately, we can't designate everything, but if your neighborhood can be designated, what I'm seeing is that basically if you kind of don't run that flag up there and say we value this place, then don't expect someone who's not from your area to value it. You know, you kind of have to do a good job of that. And what I'm seeing is there are different neighborhoods, and some of them quite well to do, some of them more middle class, and that's not happening. They're not thinking of themselves as historic, and they're losing properties. They're have other people coming in and doing tear downs and things of this sort. So I think you know, you unfortunately you have to kind of be proactive about doing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a component in all these other programs as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're close on time, so I do want to wrap up. I just wanted to note for everyone that there have been a lot of really great links and comments in the chat, so do take a look at those, and including some references to other organizations. I think something that has come up in this last round of questions and conversations is the idea of kind of building sort of different alliances and partnerships for the work for preservation that may link to work that's happening with community groups or grassroots organizations, or with other organizations like the community development corporations or housing and economic development groups to work together to do work connected to preservation. I definitely wanted to underline a point that Paula made, which is that preservation really provides an opportunity for us to think about development in a different way, right? That's kind of more holistic and can think about people and place and what we call place keeping. That's as important as the necessary work of placemaking that may have some economic development type objectives. with that, I want to thank all of the sort of attendees that offered these great questions and conversation. And of course, our panelists, Paul, Paula, and Mark. And with that, I will turn it back over to Callie.
Thanks, Justin. And thank you all so much for attending tonight and for our panelists for taking their time to share their wisdom and talk to us about this. We were recording this program, and so we will have it available on IHS's YouTube channel and website in the upcoming weeks. That also being said, I know there were a lot of links in the chat. We'll send most of those out to you in an email following tomorrow. I will also add some links to IHS's digital collection so you can dig into some of the photos of these buildings that we talked about, amongst others, and some of my favorite collections within it, including our really robust Indianapolis bicentennial collection that we've been putting together over the past years in anticipation for our 18-month commemoration. If you enjoyed this program, we hope you'll come back for more. IHS is opening our newest exhibit called Lost Landmarks next week on January 9th, and it will be available for viewing in our Lilly Hall through April. So we'd love for you to reserve a ticket online, come visit us in your trendiest mask and check it out. We also have an exhibit on Indianapolis's bicentennial called You Are There 1920 Celebrate Indianapolis. You can find out how we celebrated our centennial and how the city has changed over the last 200 years. It's amazing. There's a ton of images that you can dig into. It's a great time to come visit. Again, just reserve your ticket in advance. If you're looking for a free day to come visit us, our first one of the year will be on Monday, January 25th, which is Martin Luther King Day. So we'll have special programming going on that day in person. Again, you have to reserve your ticket early, and we want to see you in those masks. If virtual is more your style like this, we have lots to offer you. Join us tomorrow to talk about your research resolutions at our virtual research roundtable, which is an informal gathering of both of historians on Zoom. And then on January 14th, on next Thursday, we'll have our next History Happy Hour, an informal conversation with our own Susan Hall Dotson, looking at Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy here in Indiana. I believe in the chat, we're going to be posting the link where you can find out information about this and lots more that we have coming up. Again, you'll get an email from us tomorrow with all the links, and there'll be a survey. It'll take you about 1 minute. We'd love to know what you thought, what you want more of, and how we can offer events like this in the future. So thank you so much for joining us. We hope you stay safe, stay sane, and stay healthy, and we can't wait to see everybody in the future. Bye, everybody.